Today's trail begins here at the Quakers burial ground at Ball Street Gardens. John Bright, the MP, who knew John Ashworth, is buried here. John Ashworth admired the Society of Friends, or the Quakers. Someone apparently once jokingly said that he was half Quaker and half Methodist because he loved the consistent, unworldly lives of the Quakers. Rochdale was obviously very different in John Ashworth's day. There was a completely different landscape of buildings. On the 3rd of February 1866, John Ashworth wrote in his diary, "S at the door in rags with a black eye, asking me to look to her 2 boys. Sent one to school and bought the other a shirt." The person that he's referring to as S was a young woman named Sarah, who once loved and served God well, but married a man called Stephen against godly advice and ended up in an abusive relationship with a cruel, idle, drunken husband. After moving to Rochdale with their 2 boys, Sarah and Stephen started going to the chapel for the destitute. Stephen also started working as a hawker, selling cockles and mussels, but his drinking and violence continued. On one occasion, he even threatened to chop Sarah's head off. John Ashworth wrote a strange tale about Sarah. It was called "I Will Have Him." Once, John Ashworth said, "In the dead of night, Sarah lost reason. She leapt out of bed and ran down the Foundry Brow to the end of Water Street in nothing but a nightdress, where she stood still, looked up at the full moon and started singing, waking up her neighbours who looked out on the strange, astonishing scene." John Ashworth lived at 56 Drake Street, which is here where Champness Hall is now. He had a painters and grocers shop here. So Champness Hall opened in 1925, so obviously it wasn't here in John Ashworth's day, but this is where he lived and where his shop was, on the same spot. Apparently this up here is, or was known as, the Foundry Brow. And this was at one point filled with houses. So it sounds as though Sarah, in the tale that John Ashworth wrote, ran down here to Drake Street and then ran down to the end of Water Street. In his tale, My Young Ragged Friends, John Ashworth talks about a boy called Tommy Jones who came to his office asking him to get him a pair of clogs. Tommy Jones said that he had at one point lived on Mason Street, which is just here. This little street is called Greenwood Street. A lady called Ellen Williams died here. Ellen Williams was an alcoholic who sought help from John Ashworth at the Chapel for the Destitute. Sadly, Ellen's addiction led to her death. She died at 14 Greenwood Street, where she then lived after taking poison. John Ashworth wrote one of his strange tales about Ellen Williams. An inquest into Ellen Williams' death was held at the Citizen Inn in April 1862. The Citizen Inn was this building here. In the Rochdale Observer on the 25th of April 1862 it said, "It appears the unfortunate woman had committed suicide by taking poison and was found dead on a chamber floor in Greenwood Street." Another character in one of John Ashworth's strange tales was a man he called Old Wilkins. His real name was James Wilkinson. He was a shopkeeper and a pawnbroker. And he lived in an area here called Vicar's Moss. Old Wilkins thought reading the Old or New Testament was a waste of time, but when he did so it led to his conversion. He said if he'd have read the New Testament 30 years earlier he'd have been a different man. His neighbour Michael Todd was a Christian, and he offered to read and pray with Wilkins 50 times a day if he wanted him to. Michael Todd lived on Livesey Street, which is this street. John Ashworth was with Wilkins when he died. His last words were, "Blessed Jesus." Mr. Ashworth said Wilkins had been saved by the skin of his teeth because he'd come to faith so late on in life. He died in 1856.